Good day, students. In this lecture, we are going to look at a new chapter, that is Chapter 8, which is in Unit 3. And the name of the chapter is Cell, the Unit of Life. Please be informed it carries around 5 marks. Now, in this chapter, as the name itself suggests, it's going to look at the different fundamental aspects and the functions of the cell. And we all know that the cell is the basic unit of life, and it makes up the body of the individual. So today, specifically in this lecture, we are going to look at the cell theory, and we are going to take a look at the different structural aspects of the cell. We are also going to look at the differences between a prokaryotic and a eukaryotic cell. Now we know by now that a bacterial cell is a typical prokaryotic cell. Okay, and you have some idea of the prokaryotic cell organization. So we're going to revise that and of course learn a little bit more. Eukaryotic cell, we are going to look at the plant and the animal cell. So we're going to compare how a plant cell differs from an animal cell. So that is a short kind of preview of what we're to do in this lecture. So let's move on to the first slide. Now, the first thing to understand is that any organism is composed of cells, be it a unicellular organism or a multicellular organism. So, if you take a single celled organism like amoeba, paramecium, these are some common examples. You know that it is composed of cells. Or you take a multicellular organism like a human being, it is composed of cells, the only difference being the number. So let's look next at what exactly is a cell. So in your text, this is the definition given. So if you want to put it in one sentence, the cell is the fundamental structural and functional unit of all living organisms. To break what this means is that a cell can function as a unit on its own. If you try to divide the cell into finer bits, you will of course get atoms and molecules and your subatomic particles, but they will not be able to function as a living structure on its own. So cell is the fundamental, okay, that means the basic unit which can function all by itself and be a living element. Then, who was the first person who described a live cell? So today we are very fortunate to have a lot of microscopes, and a lot of instruments and instrumentation in science, and we're able to zoom and look at the tiniest of organisms. So back then it was a big challenge, and it was Anton von Leeuwenhoek who first described a live cell. Okay, and the discovery of the nucleus, as you can see here on my slide, is credited to Robert Brown. So let's not forget these people, because they were the pioneers in looking at the cell, understanding the structural details of the cell, and so on. Then at around that time, there was also the invention of the microscope, and as this technology improved, the microscope, which is the simple and the compound type, finally it improved in such a manner that it got converted into the electron microscope. So technology was upgraded, and today we have microscopes that can magnify. The job of the microscope is to magnify a tiny structure or a tiny organism. Today we are blessed with microscopes that can multiply um, the magnification to such an extent that we can see the tiniest of cells. Okay, so please remember this, that at that time you had these people who were making use of the microscope to look at the structural details, and because the microscope was invented at around that time, they were able to do so. In the next slide, we are also talking about uh, other great men like Schladen and Schwann. So if you read in your text, as you know, I can't put all the sentences in the text here. These people did extensive work on animal and plant cells. And in their studies, okay, from their discoveries, from their inventions, from their observations, whatever they saw and they did, they formulated what was called as the cell theory. Please remember, they formulated it. That means they said this is possible, this is a hypothesis. Now hypothesis means that they are saying that this could be a probability. Okay, they explain this could have been the structure of the cell, but they were not able to say that yes, this is the structure of the cell. It was much later another scientist by the name Virchow or Virchow, however you want to pronounce it, Rudolf Virchow, he explained that it is what Schladen and Schwann were trying to express and to explain through their work. He said there is truth to it, and he said that indeed cells divide and produce new cells from pre-existing cells. Okay, and he explained it in a much better way, or you can say that he kind of gave proof to what they were saying, and therefore he modified their hypothesis, and that gave birth to what we now know as the cell theory. So usually in some books they said the cell theory was given by Schladen and Schwann, but please remember that these people formulated the theory. They could not explain how new cells were formed, and it was with Rudolf Virchow's help that they were able to explain. Okay, so or he modified their hypothesis and the cell theory came into being. So let's look at what the cell theory is, because when the cell theory was out in those days, as you know, if any new discovery is out or invention is out, there's a lot of hype about it, everyone gets so excited. So at that time the cell theory was the big thing. So they wanted to know, we want to know, okay, why cell theory was something that was widely acclaimed, okay, and everybody wanted to know what were their findings. So according to this cell theory, there are two important findings. The first one, which I've highlighted in yellow, is that all living organisms are composed of cells and products of their cells. And second, all cells arise from pre-existing cells. So they were able to establish that living organisms are indeed composed of cells. And how do these cells come about? They don't just get created from nothing, but one cell will give rise to another cell. So there has to be a pre-existing mother cell which will divide and give rise to daughter cells. I hope this is clear in this slide. Now, just to ask you a few questions, if this was a live class, I would be able to ask you these questions to make sure you've understood my first two slides. But anyways, make sure that you're able to answer these questions, because these questions are based on the first slide. Okay, these same questions you will find in Google Classroom. The same questions will be there in the summary document which is sent to you. Now we move on to the next slide, and here is something you studied in school, the plant versus the animal cell. So we got to identify the differences between a plant cell and an animal cell. Okay, again, if it was a live class, I'm sure you would be able to point out all the differences, but since we cannot do that, I will just list the differences for you. Okay, so the first difference, obvious differences of course, is the presence of a cell wall for a plant cell, and therefore it is having a definite shape. And we all know that the cell wall is made of cellulose in case of plant cells. Whereas in an animal cell, as you can see, it has a more or less irregular structure. That is because it does not have this rigid outer cell wall. Okay, and it only has the inner plasma membrane or the cell membrane surrounding the cytoplasm. Whereas plant cell, it has cell wall plus the inner plasma membrane. This is the first difference. The second obvious difference is if you see the vacuoles, okay, the vacuoles, You all know this. Here you will see numerous vacuoles and much smaller in size vacuoles. Whereas if you look at a plant cell, you will see a large, more or less central vacuole. So this is the difference between a plant cell and a animal cell with regards to vacuole. The next difference is the type of organelles. So if you look at my diagram here, whatever is listed in green is exclusive to the plant cell. That means it's present only in the plant cell, and that is chloroplast, which is the organelle containing chlorophyll, cell wall I already told you about, and plasmodesmata, which are the kind of the breaks in the cell wall through which the cytoplasms of adjoining cells interconnect. Okay, coming to the animal cells, here you have the centrioles, which are important at the time of cell division, lysosomes, which are called the suicidal bags of the cell. Now, why this interesting term? Lysosome or the suicidal bags will release enzyme and cause the breaking up of the entire cell. That's why it is called as lysosome. When does this happen? When the cell becomes old and it needs to get destroyed. So at that time, the cell kind of self destructs. Okay, it breaks down on its own because the lysosomes will burst and enzymes will cause the breakage of the cell. Then we also have the centrosome again, which helps in at the time of mitosis and meiosis, which is cell division. So these are the main differences between plant and animal cell. The other organelles are more or less the same. Now, characteristics of cells. Now let's look at what is there in a typical cell, whether it is a plant cell or an animal cell, whether it's a eukaryotic or a prokaryotic cell. So the first thing is that the cells have cell wall. I told you if it is a plant cell, it will have one. If it's an animal cell, it will not have. Cells also have cell membranes. The next characteristic is presence of a nucleus. Now, with there is a difference with this nucleus. So in a eukaryotic cell, the nucleus is well defined, whereas in a prokaryotic cell, the nucleus is not well defined. The meaning of this is, in a prokaryotic cell, the nucleus is not having the nuclear membrane.